One of the dumbest things I did in my youth during my urban exploration phase was to agree to check out some abandoned places for some sketchy people to hold a rave. I was never into the whole electronic music scene, nor was I interested in taking shit like ecstasy for a good time, but they gave me $500 up front and a couple of places on a map. The only condition was I keep my mouth shut and there'd be an additional $500 when I brought back my scouting report. I don't know that sketchy quite paints the real picture of Dave, the guy in charge who was paying me. He was one of those Hollywood kids whose parents barely played a role in his life growing up except to blame him when a role went to someone else. A guy who was convinced he was the main character in the story when in fact he was barely an afterthought to anyone who wasn't buying drugs from him. These were the days before people filmed their trespassing for followers and likes. You were more likely to get your ass shot off with rock salt or worse. Recording your own evidence against yourself for YouTube was ages away. It took a few days of thinking about it before I agreed to take the job. $1,000 was a lot of money to me, and by the time, and honestly if I had known the locations, I'd have probably already visited them on my own dime. The two locations were in drastically different areas in California. One was an abandoned warehouse that was well known to everyone except apparently Dave. It had a history of squatters, gang activity, more than a couple of murders, and a fire during a, wait for it, a rave that took out the roof and forced the place to finally be condemned. I did make sure to double check the location to verify it was not an option and even verify with Dave that he hadn't given me the wrong address. Man, it's all good. Look, the place up north is better anyway. All sorts of trees to block the noise so we don't get any illegal interference. We can hit Humboldt on the way for buds and shit. I know that place is up there, I just need you to make sure it's still there, Dave said over the phone. To say the other place was way up north was an understatement, as this place was easily an 11-plus hour drive from Hollywood almost all the way up to Oregon. Mostly on the 5, but a good way on the 101 as well, then a few other roads, and Jesus, this was becoming not worth $1,000 to me. I couldn't even imagine how he was going to get a bunch of rave kids up there. Not my problem, not what I was being paid to do. The town itself was called Hewing or Hewwood. Dave wasn't sure, but the directions were very detailed and he seemed to know it was a real place. My mom filmed some movie up there when I was really young. She was fucking the director or some shit. That's the only reason she got the job. About the same time Dad was filming commercials in Japan. I've been there a couple of times since then. Old lumber town that went out of business because of an owl or something. I think some circus had a fire, I don't know. But it's out of the way, no one has a reason to go there. The bright side of all this was it wasn't just a single building out in the woods. It was apparently this sizable ghost town. Even if nothing was standing there, would still be something to find. And then Dave and his group of junkheads could decide if it was worth dragging the generators needed for it, or if anyone would even show. Not my problem, though. I still wasn't looking forward to 11 hours of driving, and things like hotels and gas were going to take a big bite out of the first $500. But I was really focused on exploring abandoned places, and this fit the bill. My hesitation came from stories I had heard of places like Murder Mountain up in that area, places where growers would protect their weed at any cost. People were known to disappear up there and never be found. This place on Dave's map seemed remote enough that I thought to myself, this may end up being an extremely bad idea. I should have listened to my stomach. Instead, I got into my Toyota 4x4. The absolute worst part of the drive, outside of watching my $500 quickly dwindling thanks to overpriced gas stations out in the middle of bumfuck Egypt, was easily the radio. Once past Sonoma, once you were really in true Northern California, all the radio stations were either New Age crystal bullshit or radio interviews with people like Margaret, the lady who was having intimate relations with Bigfoot. Yeah, as entertaining as it sounds, it lost its charm after hearing her talk about her yearning for it to continue and her almost juvenile level terminologies for sexual intercourse. The trees really were the only thing that kept my interest peaked during most of the drive. Those redwoods, those amazing giant trees standing there for thousands of years. I pulled over a couple of times to take a piss on the side of the road. Traffic was almost non-existent, so I took my time during those breaks to walk around a bit and breathe in the air. Growing up near Hollywood, you always got the smog from all the traffic. Where I lived off the 405, it was unhealthy at best. There were people I knew growing up who had no idea that there were hills nearby because they had never seen them through the smog. Calling this place a breath of fresh air was not only accurate, but somehow barely described it. It was refreshing and relaxing. But daylight was fading, and there was still a good couple hours before I made it to the little no-name hotel I had booked a room with. If worst came to worst, I knew of a place in Humboldt. Either way, it meant getting back in the truck. The rest of the drive went smoothly, albeit I now know far more rhetoric about the vibrational, energy-based system of healing with crystals than I'll ever have a use to know. The motel I stayed at was about what you'd expect for $19 a night. Cinder block walls and poured concrete floors, a dual AC heater protruding from the wall next to the door. It had the essence of a giant oven with its sparse accommodations. You could tell at one point the floor had a proper carpet, but now it just had a couple of large rugs thrown down on either side of the bed. The toilet looked like it had sunk with the Titanic and was brought up from the depths and placed into this room. Nasty is an understatement. The bed had either been broken or was pieced together using an incomplete frame. The mattress itself had no box spring, just a pallet nailed to sideboards that it laid upon. This was to be some real high society living. Worse even than that, the town had closed up for the night around 5 p.m. It was now almost midnight, and I was starving. Thankfully, the one thing the hotel did have was a vending machine with a number of treats that looked like they went back to the Carter administration. I was too hungry to care. I carried my spoils back to the room, ate, and passed out. With a vast wilderness literally surrounding me everywhere, I decided that on the way back home, I'd just simply sleep in the back of my truck. The camper shell would give me enough privacy, and the pile of moving blankets would help keep me warm. Far less sketchy than spending another nice day at this place. The next morning, I got up early enough to grab a free cup of coffee and a banana before checking out and driving the next few hours to my destination. The coffee was barely dark enough to call coffee, and the banana had something wiggling in it, so I decided to just stop at a roadside diner and cut my losses. Finally, back on the road, it took another hour to find the first of several roads that cut off from the main highway. It was slow going for much of it, but when I had finally come up on the final road, I started to get excited. It was overgrown. It was obvious no one came up this way often. I had a sudden fear that it would be very obvious that a vehicle had passed through here, and hoped that my 4x4 was high enough that it would have knocked down the minimal brush and weeds. I had mixed fears regarding possible unfriendly growers, hoping that all the growth here meant no one kept an eye on the area. With caution, I slowly made my way down the road. The further I ventured down it, the more obvious that this place hadn't been visited in years. It was a bit of a relief, I had to admit. I figured at the time that if it was this overgrown, then I could just camp here tonight, as no one would be the wiser. I really wish I hadn't. The road came to a rather abrupt end where a large security gate stood. It had obviously been painted yellow when it was installed, but the paint was almost all chipped away. Beyond the gate, the road did continue on in what was to be the first of several buildings. I backed up and found a small clearing off the side of the road, obscured from it by trees and overgrowth. My confidence had greatly improved at this point, and I had no doubt that I had this place to myself to explore for as long as I decided to stay. I grabbed my backpack, which among other things had my flashlight with a fresh set of 4D cell batteries in it, a small toolkit for getting into wherever I needed to get into, and a .22 caliber revolver. The gun wasn't much, but if there were some bums squatting in here, at least I'd have something to protect myself with. The first building was a gas station, the remains of one really. You could tell where the pumps had been. Most of the structure was burned out and caved in. The best part of it though, over to the side were the lower remains of one of those Muffler Man statues. The top half looked as though it was pulled down by force, with a chain still tightly wrapped around its neck. Made me wonder for a moment. What happened first, the statue or the fire? Vandalism? I didn't waste too much daylight on it. It was one of those things that was at the heart of my need to explore, but I had what was left of my money to earn, and I knew from experience that daylight is a precious commodity. Next up was a surprise to me. It was a pair of old cars just sitting off to the side in the trees. I couldn't tell who the maker was. Neither had more than the cab and pieces and parts of the engine block. The rusted patina made these both look spooky and amazing all at once. I was happy to see there wasn't any graffiti on either of them. They were just left and forgotten. The road continued up for a ways and began to turn towards the left. I could see from the distance that there was finally something looking like a sidewalk, but the area had already long ago begun to reclaim the area, and it dawned on me I should be conscious of snakes and ticks. It was then that I got the first smell of it, like burning burlap. There was no smoke in the air, and the smell seemed old. I'm not sure how to clearly explain it, like I was smelling an antique blanket that had been in a place that had burned down. I couldn't see anything. I started to assume it was from the gas station, but that area didn't have any smell of note. I continued on my way. Around the bend, I was almost in a state of shock. There were the remnants of a main street, small buildings, many that were completely dilapidated, and others that looked as if you could open them for business with little work at all. Nothing that looked burnt, though, and the smell was growing stronger as I made my way further in. The houses that were still standing looked as if a stampede had run through them. Doors, not just open, but completely busted outward. Some of the remnants of doors out past the yard and onto the sidewalk. I suddenly had a scary thought. Bigfoot. "Just keep your sexy time to market there, Bigfoot," I said out loud in no particular direction. "She's your type. I am certainly not." The sheer absurdity made me laugh, until I realized I said that out loud, and now if anyone was here, I could have a problem. I pushed on past the houses to an interesting intersection, one where on one side was the obvious schoolhouse and on the opposite side a beautiful church, both in greatly better condition than anything else in the town so far. A little past these, I could see what looked to be what was probably the center of town. I could see a gazebo and what looked to be a park. I decided that I could wait. The church just looked too amazing to pass up. That ever-present smell of smoke seemed to lighten as I got closer to the church. The doors were all intact, which, considering everything else, had surprised me a bit. Also, again, made me cautious. I began to wonder why and how this building and the schoolhouse seemingly had avoided being vandalized like the house and everything else so far in town. I decided to break out some of my tools and see if I could force the lock. As luck would have it, it didn't take much effort at all. The door itself had rotted around the deadbolt, and I pretty much just pushed it out of position, opened the door, and walked in. As soon as I walked in, the sound around me changed. It was as if I had cut my ears with my hands. Sound seemed like it was coming from a tunnel or a cave. I held my nose and tried to make my ears pop. Made it worse. My equilibrium started to go haywire. I both felt like I was floating as well as tipping over. My vision started to clip from left to right, though my eyes were not moving. I began to vomit uncontrollably, and when it stopped, I moved over to a church pew and sat down, leaning forward with my head towards my lap. My arms were up and over my head as if to block it from some invisible blow. Without realizing it, I must have passed out. I was still sitting in the pew, but I could see through the gap in the door that it was night out. With me being as disoriented as I was, I never thought to question why the inside of the church seemed to be lit up. There were no obvious lights in the structure that I could see, but everything was bright as day inside. I got up to look out the doors to see what I could, other lights, etc. There was a new smell, that of popcorn. "Are you leaving?" a young female voice asked. "What the fuck? Who's there?" I said, halfway shitting my pants. I'd been sitting there prone for who knows how long, and now there's a voice? Was the only response. Still a bit disoriented, I looked around the small church as much as I could. All the while, the sound continued, distant, but right on top of me. "I'm sorry," I screamed. "You just startled me." I said this, trying to assure the person that they didn't need to run. "Did you come for the show?" she asked. Her voice seemingly came from everywhere, in every direction, but somehow really close. The hair on my arms began standing up. I remember that every ounce of energy I had was about to use bolting for the door out, even visualized it. But I was back in the pew. My getting up to look out the door felt like I had only dreamed it, but now Now I knew I was awake. I tried to get out, and once more I visualized getting up and heading towards the door, but again, I was back in the pew. People don't come to the church anymore, not since the circus. Her voice had a sadness to it, but it felt misleading. There was certainly an air to her voice that had the sentiment of a spider toying with its food. "Who are you? Do you live here?" I asked, not really knowing what else to do. It was quite apparent my mind and my body were not in sync with each other enough to make it out that door. "They call me Piggy," she said, in a voice that was now far more wispy in its tone. That doesn't sound very nice of them," I said. Was I dealing with some overweight runaway? One smart enough to maybe have drugged me somehow? I only heard what sounded like a deep breath being taken in, but never exhaled. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering you. I was sent here to see the town." "And the circus," she said again, with a slightly more joyful tone in the way she said it. "I don't know about the circus," I said. "Why don't you tell me about it?" I could see a small petite figure move from what had been the pulpit of the church towards the 5 or so steps leading down. It was the only place the light wasn't illuminating. She had a strange cadence to her walk. My eyes were still having difficulties focusing. When I moved my line of sight too quickly, the world would spin for a moment. She did seem to take a seat on the steps. She began telling her story by telling me that her and her older sister were part of the circus. My sister, she was 3 years older than me. She started with our father back when he was doing revivals. Revivals? I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, not until she continued. Dad kept getting run out of places because he'd have his revival, then we would, as Mom would say, go off whoring around. There was a slight pause, almost as if she didn't understand the words she was speaking. When Mom did it, she got pregnant with me. Dad wasn't making much money at his revivals and ended up joining another group and putting together a circus with this big tent. We all traveled by big trucks. I remember I was always looked after by the clowns. "How is it you are so far away from me right now, but you're so loud, you're in my head?" I asked. The disorientation wasn't going away. She didn't seem to notice me speaking. "Dad would call me Mommy's little pig baby. Some of the clowns just took to calling me Piggy. Clowns were nice. People were scared of them, and they should be. They can be..." She trailed off. I remember this moment of clarity, where all I could think to do was run towards the door. But I had been so turned around by my disorientation that the direction I ran took me closer to the girl. She looked up, and I could see the young face. Teenager at best, but tiny. She spoke like an older girl, but she was so small. The disorientation came back, and I was forced to sit down. I remember trying to focus on her, but it was like there was a shadow in my way. "We came here in the summer. The town was small, and they seemed to appreciate that we made our way up to stop here. We performed for 2 nights with the people of the town showing up for both shows. Someone caught my sister's eye. She was like Mom in that. There was always a boy in town that caught her eye. Dad had to take her to a special doctor we weren't allowed to talk about once because of it. The one he wanted to take Piggy to before I was born." I was horrified, but it was about to get so much worse. On the final nights, I was told to stay out of the way as everyone had to break down the tents, but something happened. No one took down the tents. I stayed with my sister, who continued to try and get me to stay behind. I pretended like I was obeying, but followed from a distance. She met up with a boy, and several other boys followed them out to the woods. I followed as close as I could without being seen, but when I started to hear the screams, I ran to where my sister was. The boys had started to stab her repeatedly, and then as I started to scream, they came at me. They dragged me off and carried my sister along as well. I heard boys talking about how bad it was and blaming each other. Then came that little murmuring sound again. The next thing I remember was as if my disorientation was drained from my feet. I could actually feel all of it from the top of my head down to my feet, like a rush of sobriety. Now with clarity back, a new fear emerged. It wasn't my disorientation that was forcing me to sit almost paralyzed. It was something else entirely. I looked over at the girl. Her head was slightly tilted forward. Her short dress was red to match her hair. The white, ruffled piece around her neck looked dirty, and there was something else about it I couldn't quite figure out. The shadows still played tricks on my eyes. They all but dragged us to a farm not too far out of the way. They tossed my sister over a wooden fence, and I could hear the sound of them. The hogs rushing to my sister, her screams as they began to bite and chew on her. I was speechless. The things this girl had to witness. I tried to muster up the words to say I'm sorry for what happened, but my jaw felt locked in position. One boy, the one who was really angry that I interrupted them, grabbed me and swung me over the fence as well. He didn't drop me, just let my legs dangle. My eyes went wide. Those shadows that had been obscuring my vision had dissipated, and I could see all. The steps she was sitting on were covered in thick, glossy, almost congealed blood. Her right leg was a red boot that matched her clown-like costume. Her left leg, what was left of it, was shredded and bloodied below the knee. Her left hand was disfigured but looked to be intact. In her right hand, she seemed to be holding someone else's hand. Maybe a doll? With the rest of it hidden behind her? She looked at me with eyes that seemed to glow in a ghostly white, face covered in blood. I couldn't tell if the skin was pale or if that was clown makeup she was wearing. But when she looked at me, I felt as if I was done. She was in control, and I was hers to do with what she would. I heard the clowns. They called for their Piggy. The boy dropped me and I screamed, which brought them to us. One quickly grabbed me away from a hog that had begun to drag me away by the hand, and another who had my leg. As he did, I grabbed for my sister's hand as he pulled me out. The boys scattered, heading back to town. The clowns followed. I kept holding my sister's hand. I had tears in my eyes at this point. No idea what was to be my fate, but what had happened to this young girl was atrocious. She continued. Eventually, they gathered up those boys and others into the tent. The clowns went to every house and brought everyone to the tent. The town was found guilty and the fire burned. I haven't been to a circus since then. I miss the circus. She moved closer to me. The strange cadence I saw in her walk was actually the limp from missing most of her leg. How she made it to me at all was otherworldly. Circuses need people, she said as she ran her mangled hand across my cheek. You sleep now, and tomorrow you go back to tell them to come. I mustered all my strength and will and was able to just ask one question to her. But what is your real name? They called me Piggy. I woke up in the back of my truck, wrapped up in my moving blankets. At the time, I couldn't remember the girl or her story. It was like the entire memory had been surgically removed, leaving only images in my mind. A giant tent at the center of town. The only thought I had as I drove back was that it would be perfect for Dave's rave. I drove back down to Southern California, back to Hollywood, where I met up with Dave. I gave him all the details I could remember, everything about how a giant tent would be perfect there. So much room. The bigger the tent, the better. He paid me my $500 and thanked me. It was months later that I heard the news. Dave had held his rave with an estimated 150 or so people. They can only estimate because during the rave a fire broke out. What remains they were able to locate were burned beyond identification. The ensuing fires ravaged what was left of the buildings in town, save for a small church that had survived and a small house further in the woods with a large hog pen behind it. From what was reported, the only person to make it out of the fire was Dave. The reason they knew this is from the chewed-up remains they found and were able to identify. Most of him had been devoured, and authorities theorized that the only reason the hogs didn't finish their meal was that they escaped the pen in fear of the fire. They could find no sign that there had been anyone living in the house, nor signs of hogs having been there in decades. Just another fact that seemed to get skimmed over in light of the greater tragedy and loss of life. It was after reading about the incident that all the memories flooded back of the girl, what had happened to her. I don't understand any of it. I spent a good amount of time looking up whatever information I could. Beyond the fire at the rave and what happened to Dave, there was nothing. Nothing of previous fires on record or information about a circus. Stranger still, all reports of the fire that killed Dave and the others lacked a single detail about location. No photos, No eyewitness accounts, no survivors, just a few short blurbs in the local papers and obituaries. I tried to find out what movie his mother had filmed up there, but no such film exists, or at least was ever released. There was no modern record of any town called Hewing or Hewood ever existing, or of the girl they called Piggy.